The sky cracked open with a roar, rain slamming against my windows like tiny fists of fury. I thought I was safe inside, until I looked outside. That's when I saw my neighbor doing something that sent chills down my spine. And what happened next? I still can't believe it. The night started off deceptively calm. A few weather warnings flashed on my phone earlier in the evening, but I barely paid them any attention. Storms were common this time of year, loud, messy, but rarely dangerous. So I went about my usual routine, making myself a cup of tea and settling onto the couch, the hum of the television filling the room with soft background noise. Then, the wind picked up. At first, it was just a low whistle against the windows, the kind that made the house creak ever so slightly. But within minutes, that soft whistle turned into a full-blown howl, rattling the glass as if something outside was desperately trying to get in. The rain followed, slamming down in sheets, heavy and relentless. Thunder boomed, each rumble growing closer, shaking the walls. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then, darkness. My heart gave a small jump as the entire house was swallowed by the pitch-black void. I sat still for a moment, listening to the wind scream through the trees outside. The power outage wasn't surprising. It happened often during heavy storms. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but just then, a bright flash lit up the entire sky. Lightning. For a second, everything outside was bathed in an eerie white glow. And that's when I noticed something strange. Across the street, my neighbor's house still had lights. I frowned. How was that possible? If the entire block had lost power, his house should have gone dark too. Maybe he had a generator. That made sense. But then, as another bolt of lightning split the sky, I saw movement. A shadowy figure stepped onto his porch, barely visible. In the torrential downpour, it was him, my neighbor. I watched, expecting him to hurry back inside. The storm was getting worse by the second. But instead, he moved with slow, deliberate steps down his driveway. His flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam bouncing off the sheets of rain. I could see the wind tugging at his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. That's when I noticed where he was heading. His backyard. More specifically, his shed. A strange unease settled in my stomach. Why would anyone go outside in weather like this? Especially just to check on a shed. The storm. Wind was strong enough to knock over trees. If he wasn't careful, he could get hurt. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, watching as he struggled to pull open the shed door. It resisted at first, the storm fighting against him. But after a moment, he managed to slip inside. The door slammed shut behind him, swallowed by the darkness. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then, bang. A loud crash shattered the night. My pulse spiked. The sound had come from his yard. Something was wrong. I leaned closer, straining to see. Through the sheets of rain, my breath fogged up the glass, and I wiped it away with my sleeve. But no matter how hard I squinted, I couldn't make out anything beyond the shadows of the storm. The wind howled again, shaking the trees so violently that branches snapped, crashing onto the pavement. Another bright flash of lightning illuminated the yard for just a second, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Water. It was rushing toward his shed, flooding the ground around it like a rising tide. If he was still in there, he could be in serious trouble. I grabbed my jacket, heart pounding against my ribs. Every logical part of my brain told me to stay inside where it was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Then, another sound, a faint, muffled noise carried through the storm. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was coming from the shed. I took a shaky breath. Then, before I could stop myself, I stepped outside. The moment I stepped outside, the storm hit me like a wall. The rain was ice cold, hammering down so hard it felt like needles against my skin. The wind roared, nearly knocking me off balance. My jacket was useless. Within seconds, I was drenched, my clothes clinging to me as I stumbled forward. But I didn't care. Something was wrong, and I had to find out what. I kept my eyes locked on the shed. The door was still shut, but the water around it was rising fast. If my neighbor was inside, he might already be trapped. My heart pounded as I forced myself forward, my feet splashing through the growing flood. "Hey, are you in there?" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. No response. I gritted my teeth and pushed ahead, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. I expected it to open easily, but it didn't. It was jammed, stuck. Panic shot through me. "Hey, open the door!" I banged my fist against the wood, hoping, praying that he could hear me. Still nothing. Only the relentless sound of the rain, the howling wind, and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, just as I was about to call for help, I heard it. A noise. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper beneath the storm. But it was there, a soft, desperate sound coming from inside the shed. A whimper, not a human voice. Something else. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was I imagining it? Had the wind played tricks on my ears? Then I heard it again. A small, terrified whine. It was an animal. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. My neighbor wasn't just out here for no reason. He was inside that shed because of whatever, or whoever, was trapped with him. And if I didn't get this door open soon, the rising water might make it impossible. Adrenaline surged through me. I planted my feet and yanked at the door with all my strength. It barely budged. The storm had swollen the wood, making it nearly impossible to move. I braced myself and pulled again. Harder this time, my muscles straining as I fought against the resistance. Finally, the door gave way with a loud creak. It didn't open fully, just enough for me to slip inside. And the moment I did, my heart nearly stopped. There, crouched in the dim glow of a flashlight, was my neighbor. He was drenched, his clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. His breathing was ragged, his face tight with strain. But what caught my attention wasn't him. It was what he was holding in his arms. A dog. A small, shivering dog. Its fur dripping wet, its eyes wide with fear. My neighbor looked up, relief flashing across his face when he saw me. "The door wouldn't open," he gasped. "I couldn't leave him." I stared at him, my mind racing. He had risked everything, his safety, his own life, to save this little creature. While the rest of us were hiding in our homes, waiting for the storm to pass, he had been out here, fighting against the elements for something most people wouldn't have even noticed. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "We have to get out of here," I said. "The water's rising fast." He nodded, tightening his grip on the trembling dog. Together we turned toward the door. But just as we were about to step outside, a massive gust of wind hit the shed, shaking the walls with terrifying force. For a split second I thought the entire structure was going to collapse. Then, a loud crack. Something snapped outside. We barely had time to react before a tree branch, thick and heavy, came crashing down right in front of the shed. I stumbled backward, my heart leaping into my throat. That could have hit us. If we had left just a second earlier, we would have been crushed beneath it. My neighbor looked at me, his expression mirroring my shock. The storm wasn't just dangerous anymore. It was deadly, and we were still trapped. For a second, neither of us moved. The massive tree branch lay sprawled across the ground, its jagged edges barely visible in the darkness. Rainwater poured over it, rushing in streams down the flooded yard. My neighbor clutched the shivering dog tighter against his chest, his breathing heavy. "We can't go that way," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. He nodded, his jaw tight. "We need another way out." The shed was small, barely big enough for the two of us, and with the wind rattling its wooden walls, it felt like it could come apart at any moment. The water had already seeped inside, pooling around our feet. If we didn't move fast, we'd be in serious trouble. I scanned the space, searching for another exit, but there was nothing. Just the one door, now blocked. The only other way out was the window. It was small, positioned high up on the back wall. Too small for both of us to fit through easily. But maybe, just maybe, we could get the dog out first. "There," I pointed. "We can pass him through." My neighbor hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "I'll lift him up. You pull him through." I waded through the knee-high water, my legs heavy with the weight of my soaked clothes. Reaching up, I fumbled with the latch, my fingers trembling from the cold. The wood was swollen from the rain, making it difficult to pry open. Gritting my teeth, I gave it a hard shove, once, twice, until finally it creaked open just enough to push something through. "Okay," I said, bracing myself. "Pass him up." My neighbor hoisted the dog, lifting him high above his head. The poor thing whimpered, his little body shaking like a leaf. I reached up, wrapping my hands around his soaked fur. With one final push, I guided him through the narrow opening, making sure he landed safely outside. For a moment, relief washed over me. At least he was safe. But then, boom. A violent gust of wind slammed against the shed, shaking it so hard that I stumbled. My neighbor grabbed my arm to steady me, his eyes wide with alarm. "We need to go. Now." I turned back to the window, but one look at it told me what I already feared. It was too small for us. There was no way we could squeeze through in time. That left one option. The door. I took a deep breath. "We'll have to move the branch." He stared at me for a second, then nodded. Without another word, we turned and pushed through the floodwater, making our way to the entrance. The door was barely hanging on, its frame rattling with every gust of wind. I placed my hands against the damp wood, feeling the weight pressing against it from the outside. "We push together on 3, I said, swallowing my fear. 1, 2, 3! We shoved with all our strength. The door groaned, resisting at first, but slowly, inch by inch, it gave way. As soon as it opened, rain lashed against my face, the wind nearly knocking me backward. The fallen tree branch was still there, massive and slick with water, but it had shifted slightly. "Help me move it," my neighbor yelled over the storm. We braced ourselves against the wind, grabbing onto the thick, heavy branch. My muscles screamed in protest as we pulled with everything we had. The wet bark was slippery beneath my fingers, making it almost impossible to get a good grip. Then, just as I thought we wouldn't be able to move it, it shifted. With one final, desperate pull, we managed to drag it just far enough to squeeze past. "Go!" my neighbor shouted. I didn't hesitate. I pushed forward, forcing my way through the narrow gap, my legs nearly giving out from exhaustion. My neighbor was right, behind me. The second we were out, he grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward his house. We ran, the rain blinding us, the wind screaming in our ears. My lungs burned, my body numb from the cold. But we didn't stop. Not until we reached his porch. The moment we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us, locking the storm outside. For the first time that night, I could breathe. We had made it. But as I turned to look at my neighbor, soaked and shivering, but alive. I realized something. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about what he had done, risking everything for a small, helpless creature. And that changed everything. For a moment, we just stood there, dripping water onto the wooden floor of his porch, our chests heaving with exhaustion. The storm raged on outside, but in here, it felt like we had crossed an invisible barrier, like we had barely escaped something far worse. Then, a soft whimper broke through the silence. The dog. He was curled up in the corner of the porch, still trembling, his soaked fur clinging to his tiny frame. His breathing was shallow, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat. He wasn't just cold, he was starving. My neighbor dropped to his knees, gently reaching out to the little creature. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough but filled with warmth. He ran a hand over the dog's soaked fur, his touch delicate, almost reverent. "You're safe now." The dog flinched at first, his small body tensing, but then, after a long moment, he slowly lifted his head, pressing his nose against my neighbor's palm. It was such a simple movement, but something about it made my throat tighten. "How did you find him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My neighbor sighed, still stroking the dog's fur. "I heard him crying," he said, "earlier tonight, before the storm got bad. It was faint, but I knew it was coming from somewhere near the shed." He paused, his jaw clenching. "I tried to get him then, but he was too scared. He kept running from me. Then when the storm hit, I couldn't just leave him out there." I swallowed hard. He had risked his life, not for a pet, not for something that belonged to him, but for a helpless creature he had never even met before. Something about that hit me deep. Most people would have ignored it. They would have stayed inside, safe and warm, pretending they hadn't heard anything. But not him. When the moment came to make a choice, he didn't hesitate. He stepped into the storm. And I realized I didn't even know his name. I had lived next door to him for months, maybe longer, but we had barely spoken more than a polite hello in passing. And yet, here I was, standing in his home, watching him save a life without expecting anything in return. "I'll grab a towel," I said, shaking off my thoughts. I rushed to my house, the wind still strong, but not nearly as deadly as before. Inside, I found an old towel, something soft and warm, and hurried back. When I returned, my neighbor had moved the dog inside, settling him onto a small rug near the fireplace. "Here," I said, handing him the towel. He took it with a small nod of gratitude, then carefully wrapped the dog up, rubbing his fur gently to help dry him off. The little thing let out a low, content sigh, his eyes fluttering closed. "He must have been out there for days," I murmured, kneeling beside them. "No collar, no tags, just all alone." My neighbor nodded. "Someone probably abandoned him." His voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it, like the thought of it made him angry. People do that more often than you'd think. I felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. How many storms had this little dog faced alone before this one? How many nights had he spent curled up in the cold, waiting for someone, anyone, to care? But tonight, for the first time in who knows how long, he wasn't alone, and neither were we. I glanced at my neighbor, watching as he carefully tucked the dog in, his hands moving with a gentleness that I hadn't expected. I had always assumed he was quiet, maybe even a little distant. But now, I was seeing something else. Someone kind. Someone who didn't just watch the world go by, but stepped in when it mattered most. "You're a good person," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me, surprised, then gave a small, almost shy smile. I just did what anyone should have done. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that most people wouldn't have done what he did. But instead, I just nodded, because I knew he didn't want praise. He just wanted the dog to be okay. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to die down. The wind had softened, the rain now a quiet drizzle against the windows. It was as if the world had finally taken a deep breath and let go. And as I sat there, watching the tiny dog settle into sleep for the first time in who knows how long, I realized something. This night had started as a storm, but somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, I had found something else. Something good. Something worth remembering. And it all started with a neighbor I had never really known, until now. By the time morning arrived, the storm was nothing more than a distant memory. The sky, once angry and restless, had softened into a pale shade of blue. The wind had stilled. The streets were littered with fallen branches and scattered leaves, but there was an eerie calm, like the world itself was catching its breath after the chaos of the night before. I stood on my porch, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching the soft mist rise from the damp pavement. Everything looked the same, yet different. The storm had come and gone, leaving behind a strange kind of stillness, a quiet reminder of what we had survived. And then, I saw him. My neighbor. He was standing outside his house, the little dog tucked securely in his arms, wrapped in a fresh blanket. The sight made something tighten in my chest. The night before, that dog had been alone, lost in the storm, shivering in the cold. And now, he was safe. I stepped off my porch and walked toward them, my boots splashing lightly in the puddles. The moment I got close, the dog lifted his head, his dark eyes blinking up at me with a look that made my heart melt. "He looks better," I said, nodding toward the tiny creature. My neighbor smiled, a rare, genuine expression that I hadn't seen before. "Yeah, he ate a little this morning," he said, even wagged his tail a bit. I glanced down, noticing the way the dog had nestled into his chest like he belonged there. "So, what now?" I asked. He hesitated, glancing toward the street, as if waiting for someone to suddenly appear and claim the little guy. But we both knew that wasn't going to happen. Whoever had left him out there in the first place wasn't coming back. Finally, he sighed and looked down at the dog. "I guess he stays with me." The moment he said it, the dog gave a tiny wag of his tail, as if he understood what was happening. My neighbor chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess that's decided, huh?" I smiled. "Looks like it." For the longest time, I had thought of my neighbor as nothing more than the quiet guy who lived across the street. Someone I waved to in passing but never really knew. But after last night, I saw him differently. He wasn't just quiet. He was the kind of person who ran into the storm when others stayed inside. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, we had become something we weren't before. Friends. As if reading my thoughts, my neighbor extended a hand. "I don't think we ever properly introduced ourselves," he said. I took it, shaking it firmly. "Guess not." And just like that, everything felt different. Not because the storm had changed us, but because it had revealed who we really were. As I turned to head back home, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. My neighbor stood there, holding the little dog close, looking down at him with a kind of quiet affection that made my heart swell. A storm had brought us together, but kindness had kept us there. And that was something I'd never forget.